The Mississippi heat clung to Isaac's skin like a second layer of flesh as he knelt beside his brother in the darkness of the slave quarters. Elias lay on the rough wooden planks, his back a canvas of torn flesh and dried blood. The whipping had happened 3 days ago, but the wounds still wept. Isaac dipped a rag into a bowl of water mixed with crushed herbs, yarrow and comfrey that old Mama Sable had smuggled from her garden patch behind the smokehouse. "Hold still," Isaac whispered, though Elias hadn't moved. His brother's breathing was shallow, each inhale a struggle against the pain that radiated from the 37 lashes Overseer Brant had delivered with methodical precision. 37. Isaac had counted every one from where he'd been forced to watch, held in place by Harlan's thick hand on his shoulder. The other overseer had wanted him to see, to learn, to understand what happened when you stepped out of line on Red Hollow Plantation. But Elias hadn't stepped out of line. He'd stepped in front of a child. Little Mercy, barely 8 years old, had stumbled in the cotton fields, her small hands bloodied from 12 hours of picking. She'd been too slow, her basket not full enough, and Brant had raised his whip high. Elias had moved without thinking, placing his body between the overseer and the girl. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. "You don't touch children," Elias had said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his legs. Brant had smiled. It was the kind of smile that made Isaac's stomach turn even now, 3 days later. "That's so," the overseer had drawled, tobacco juice staining his yellow teeth. "Well then, boy, I guess I'll just have to teach you about making demands." The whip had sung through the humid air, again and again and again. Isaac pressed the rag gently against one of the deeper wounds. Elias hissed through his teeth but didn't cry out. They'd learned young not to cry out. Noise brought attention, and attention on Red Hollow brought nothing but misery. "I should have stopped you," Isaac said quietly. Around them, 24 other enslaved people tried to sleep on their thin pallets, pretending not to hear. Privacy was a luxury none of them could afford, but they granted each other the illusion when they could. "You couldn't have," Elias replied, his voice rough as gravel, "and you know I'd do it again." That was the difference between them. Isaac and Elias looked so identical that their own mother had tied different colored strings around their wrists as babies to tell them apart. Same dark eyes, same broad shoulders, same scar on the left cheekbone from where they'd both fallen from the same tree on the same day, somehow managing to cut themselves on the same rock. Master Thornhill himself couldn't tell them apart without looking at their hands. Isaac had lost the tip of his right pinky finger in a cotton gin accident when he was 12. But inside, where it mattered, they were different as fire and water. Elias burned. He always had. Even as a child, he'd questioned everything, pushed against every boundary, tested every rule. Their mother used to say he'd been born with a storm in his chest where his heart should be. She died when they were 14, worked to death in the fields during a blistering August. Elias had wanted to fight then, too. Isaac had held him back, knowing that fighting would only get them both killed. Isaac was water, patient, calculating. He watched and learned and waited. He'd taught himself to read by studying the newspapers that Master Thornhill's son left scattered around the main house. He'd memorized the rhythms of the plantation, the patterns of the overseers, the blind spots in the daily routine. Knowledge was a weapon, and Isaac had been sharpening his for years. But now, looking at his brother's ruined back, Isaac felt something shift inside him. The water was beginning to boil. "They're going to kill you eventually," Isaac said, rinsing the rag. "You know that. One of these times, Brant or Harlan is going to go too far, and you'll be dead before sunset." "Then I'll die free in my mind," Elias said. "Better than living as a coward." The words stung because they weren't meant to. Elias wasn't calling Isaac a coward. He was stating what he believed to be a simple fact, that submission was cowardice, that survival through silence was the same as death. But Isaac had never seen it that way. Survival was its own form of resistance. Every day they lived was a day the masters didn't win completely. Every moment they held on to their humanity in a system designed to strip it away was a victory. Still, as he looked at the wounds on his brother's back, Isaac wondered if there was a point where survival stopped being enough. The door to the quarters opened, and everyone tensed, but it was just Mama Sable, the eldest among them, her white hair wrapped in a faded blue cloth. She carried a small tin cup filled with something that smelled bitter and medicinal. "For the pain," she said, kneeling beside Elias. Her joints cracked, and Isaac helped her settle onto the floor. "Drink it all, child. It'll help you sleep." "Don't want to sleep," Elias muttered. "Want to remember." "Oh, you'll remember," Mama Sable said, her dark eyes meeting Isaac's over Elias's prone form. There was something in her gaze that Isaac couldn't quite read. Knowledge, warning, permission. "Both of you will remember. Question is what you gonna do with that remembering." She pressed the cup to Elias's lips, and he drank. Within minutes his breathing deepened, and his body relaxed into something like rest. Mama Sable stayed kneeling, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "You thinking dangerous thoughts, Isaac. I can see it on you like a shadow." Isaac didn't deny it. There was no point in lying to Mama Sable. She'd been on Red Hollow longer than anyone, had seen 3 generations of Thornhills come and go, had buried more children than Isaac could count. She knew the weight of dangerous thoughts. "He can't survive another whipping like this," Isaac said simply. "No," Mama Sable agreed. "He can't, and you can't survive watching it happen again." She reached out and took Isaac's hand, turning it over to examine his palm. Her fingers traced the lines there, though Isaac knew she wasn't really looking at his future. She was looking at his present, at the decision already forming in his mind. "Your mama told me once that you two shared more than a face," Mama Sable said quietly. "Said you shared a soul, split down the middle at birth. 1 half fire, 1 half water. Both needed to make steam." "Mama believed in stories," Isaac said. "Stories are how we survive," Mama Sable replied. "Stories are how we remember who we are when the world tries to make us forget." She released his hand and struggled to her feet. Isaac helped her, and she patted his cheek gently. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, child, you make sure you both get away. Don't let one pay for the other's freedom. You understand me?" Isaac nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant. But 3 nights later, as he sat in the darkness, watching Elias sleep and listening to Brant and Harlan laughing drunkenly in the overseer's house across the yard, Isaac began to understand. They looked the same. Everyone said so. Even the people who knew them best sometimes mixed them up in dim light or when they weren't paying close attention. Master Thornhill had once paid Elias for work Isaac had done, never noticing the switch. If people couldn't tell them apart in life, how would they tell them apart in the chaos of a single night? The harvest moon was coming. In 1 week, it would rise full and bright over the cotton fields. The plantation would be celebrating the successful harvest with a big dinner at the main house. Brant and Harlan would drink themselves stupid, as they always did. The field hands would be given extra rations and a few hours of music in the quarters. It was Master Thornhill's way of pretending he was benevolent, of buying another year of compliance with a single night of controlled celebration. But this year, Isaac thought, the celebration would be different. This year the harvest moon would rise on Red Hollow Plantation, and by the time it set, 2 overseers would be dead, and 2 brothers would be gone. Isaac looked at Elias, at the scars that would never fully heal, and made his choice. The water had boiled, the steam was rising, and Red Hollow Plantation was about to learn that identical faces could hide very different fates. The week before, the harvest moon passed like a slow fever. Isaac moved through his days with the same careful obedience he'd always shown, but inside, his mind worked constantly, turning over the plan from every angle, looking for flaws, anticipating problems. The beauty of it was its simplicity. Complex plans failed because there were too many pieces that could break. This plan had only two pieces, himself and Elias, and they'd been moving as one since before they could walk. On the third day, Isaac began gathering what they'd need. A small bottle of nightshade berries, harvested from the plant that grew wild near the creek. Mama Sable had taught him which plants healed and which ones killed, knowledge passed down from her grandmother, who'd been a healer in a place Mama Sable called Before. The nightshade would look like apoplexy, heart failure, the kind of thing that happened to men who drank too much and worked themselves too hard in the Mississippi heat. On the fifth day, Isaac stole Overseer Harlan's favorite whiskey flask. It wasn't really stealing. He'd been sent to clean the overseer's quarters and simply picked it up when he was supposed to be dusting. He cleaned it carefully, filled it with good whiskey from Master Thornhill's own stock, another theft, this one more dangerous, and added just enough nightshade to make sure Harlan wouldn't see the next sunrise. The berries dissolved in the alcohol, invisible and tasteless. On the sixth day, Isaac told Elias the plan. They were in the tobacco barn, hanging leaves to dry. The work was quieter than the fields, and for once, they had a few minutes alone. Elias's back had healed enough that he could work again, though Isaac saw him wince with every movement. "You're insane," Elias said when Isaac finished speaking. But there was light in his eyes for the first time since the whipping. Hope. Something Isaac realized he'd been missing in his brother's face for far too long. "It'll work," Isaac said, tying off another bundle of tobacco. His hands moved automatically, leaving his mind free to review the details again. "Brant sleeps in the barn on harvest moon night. He always does. Says the noise from the quarters keeps him awake. You go to him dressed as me. He won't look twice. I'll take Harlan the flask, tell him it's a gift from Master Thornhill for the successful harvest. He's drunk enough by midnight that he won't question it." "And then," Elias asked, "then we meet at the old oak by the river, the one with the split trunk. We run. They'll send dogs. Let them. The river will hide our scent. I've been leaving food supplies hidden along the bank for a month. We follow it north for 3 days, then cut east toward free territory." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the tobacco leaves. "Why now?" he finally asked. "We could have run before. We could run without—" He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what he meant, without killing anyone. Isaac met his brother's eyes. "Because they'll never stop looking if we just run. But if Brant and Harlan are dead, and the plantation is in chaos, and there are 2 bodies in the quarters that look like they could be us, maybe we get enough of a head start. Maybe we make it. 2 bodies that look like us?" Isaac nodded slowly. "Old Marcus and Samuel the blacksmith. Both our size. Both our coloring. In the dark, with some burned cloth over their faces." He hated himself for even thinking it, but this was survival now. "They're both sick anyway. Marcus has the coughing disease. Samuel's leg wound is poisoning his blood. Mama Sable says neither of them will see winter." "You want to burn them?" Elias looked horrified. "I want us to live," Isaac said sharply. "And I want Brant and Harlan dead. Those 2 things require sacrifice. Marcus and Samuel are dying. We can make their deaths mean something. We can make it look like we died in a fire in the quarters. By the time anyone realizes the bodies aren't us, we'll be long gone." The plan was monstrous. Isaac knew that. But Red Hollow Plantation had made monsters of them all in different ways. The only question was what kind of monster you chose to be. The kind that survived, or the kind that died hoping for mercy that would never come. Elias stared at him for a long time. Then slowly, he nodded. "Mama Sable is right. You're water, cold, deep water that drowns everything it touches. And you're fire," Isaac replied. "Together we make steam. Isn't that what she said?" "Yeah," Elias said quietly. "That's what she said." That night, Isaac approached Marcus and Samuel separately. He told them the plan, expecting them to refuse, to be horrified, to turn him into Master Thornhill for even suggesting such a thing. Instead, Marcus had simply laughed, a sound that turned into a racking cough that brought up blood. "Boy," he said when he could breathe again, "I've been dying for 3 months. Doctor won't see me. Master won't waste medicine on me. I'm just waiting now. If my death can buy you boys freedom, then my death means something. You do what you got to do." Samuel had been harder to convince, but in the end, he'd agreed too. "My boy was sold south 2 years ago," he said, his infected legs stretched out in front of him, the smell of rot already beginning to seep from the wound. "I ain't never gonna see him again. But maybe if you two get free, if you make it north, maybe you can tell people what happens down here. Maybe my death helps somebody's son somewhere. That's worth more than dying slow in this place." Isaac wanted to tell them no, wanted to say he'd find another way. But there was no other way, and they all knew it. On the morning of Harvest Moon Day, Mama Sable found Isaac behind the smokehouse. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him in the damp morning air, both of them watching the sun rise over the cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "You know what you're doing is going to echo," she finally said. "Death always echoes. Violence always comes back." "I know," Isaac said. "You ready for that? For what you'll carry?" Isaac thought about Elias's back, about the whip rising and falling, about little Mercy's terrified face, about his mother worked to death in these fields, about every humiliation, every casual cruelty, every moment of degradation they'd all endured. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." Mama Sable nodded. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 small cloth bundles. "Your mama gave these to me before she died. Said to give them to you boys when the time was right." She pressed them into Isaac's hands. "Red thread for Elias, blue thread for you, same as she tied around your wrists when you were babies. Take them with you. Remember where you came from. Remember who you are." Isaac looked down at the faded threads, worn soft by time and touch. He felt something break open in his chest, some carefully controlled dam of emotion that he'd been holding back for years. "We're going to make it," he said, though he didn't know if he believed it. "Maybe," Mama Sable said, "maybe not. But either way, Red Hollow Plantation will remember this night. They all will." The day passed in a strange blur. Master Thornhill held his dinner in the main house, the smell of roasted meat drifting across the plantation, while the enslaved workers received their extra rations of cornbread and salt pork. A fiddle started playing in the quarters as evening fell, and people began to dance and sing, stealing a few hours of joy from a life that offered so little. Isaac and Elias sat together on the steps of the quarters, watching. Neither of them danced. Neither of them sang. They were waiting. "You scared?" Elias asked, as the harvest moon rose, huge and orange on the eastern horizon. "Terrified," Isaac admitted. "Me too." They sat in silence for a while longer. Then, as the moon climbed higher and the celebration began to wind down, Isaac stood. He reached out his hand, and Elias took it. They gripped each other's forearms in the way their mother had taught them, the grip of warriors, she'd said, though neither of them had understood what she meant at the time. Now Isaac understood perfectly. "See you at the oak," he said. "See you at the oak," Elias replied. And then they switched clothes in the darkness behind the quarters, becoming each other in every way that mattered. Isaac took Elias's torn work shirt. Elias took Isaac's patched trousers. They each tied their colored threads around their wrists, red on Isaac now, blue on Elias, the only way to tell them apart if anyone bothered to look closely. But no one would look closely. Not tonight. The harvest moon hung overhead, full and bright and merciless, as Isaac headed toward Overseer Harlan's house with the poisoned flask in his hand, and Elias disappeared into the shadows toward the barn where Overseer Brant lay sleeping. Red Hollow Plantation was about to learn that identical faces could hide very different fates. And by morning, the only question that would remain was whether the twins had been men or ghosts, justice or demons, brothers or something else entirely. Isaac's hands didn't shake as he knocked on Overseer Harlan's door. That surprised him. He'd expected fear to make him clumsy, to make him hesitate. But as he stood on the narrow porch of the small house where Harlan lived, the poisoned flask tucked under his arm, Isaac felt nothing but a cold, clear certainty. This man had held him down while Brant destroyed his brother's back. This man had laughed. The door opened, and Harlan stood there, already drunk from the evening celebration. His face was flushed, his eyes glazed, and he stank of whiskey and tobacco. He looked at Isaac, or who he thought was Isaac, or Elias, because Harlan couldn't tell them apart even when he was sober, with irritated confusion. "What you want, boy? It's late." Isaac kept his head down, playing the role he'd perfected over 23 years of survival, submissive, harmless, invisible. "Master Thornhill sent this for you, sir. Said to thank you for the fine harvest. Said it's his private stock, from his daddy's collection." Harlan's expression shifted from irritation to greedy pleasure. Did he now? He took the flask from Isaac's hands, turning it over to admire it. "Well, that's mighty fine of the master. Mighty fine indeed. He said to tell you to enjoy it tonight, sir, in celebration. I intend to." Harlan was already unscrewing the cap, raising the flask to his lips. He took a long pull, and Isaac watched the man's throat work as he swallowed. Once, twice, 3 times. Enough. More than enough. Harlan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and grinned. "You tell Master Thornhill I'm grateful. Now get on back to the quarters before I find some work for you to do." "Yes, sir." Isaac backed away from the door, head still down, playing his role until the very last second. Harlan was already closing the door, already taking another drink from the flask as he turned back into his small house. Isaac didn't run. Running would draw attention. Instead, he walked calmly back toward the quarters, his heart pounding but his face expressionless. Around him, the plantation was settling into sleep. The fiddle music had stopped, the laughter had faded. In the main house, lamps were being extinguished one by one. He passed the barn, where Elias would be with Brant right now. Isaac didn't look, didn't pause. Trust was everything. They'd made their plan, and now they had to execute it with perfect precision. When Isaac reached the quarters, most people were already asleep, but Mama Sable was waiting by the door, her eyes catching the moonlight. She nodded once, a blessing or an acknowledgement. Isaac couldn't tell which. Maybe both. Inside, Marcus and Samuel were awake. Isaac had told them to wait for him here. They sat on their pallets, 2 dying men who'd volunteered to become ghosts. "It's time," Isaac said quietly. Marcus struggled to his feet. Samuel needed help. His infected leg wouldn't hold his weight anymore. Between them, they hobbled outside to the small shed behind the quarters where farming tools were kept. Isaac had prepared everything earlier in the day. 2 old blankets, the lamp oil he'd stolen from the overseer's supply, kindling, flint. "You boys make it," Marcus said, his voice rough. "You hear me? You make it north and you tell people. You tell them we was human. We had names. We mattered." "I will," Isaac promised, though the words felt hollow against the enormity of what they were doing. Samuel just nodded. He was too weak for words now, the fever from his infection making his eyes bright and distant. Isaac wondered if he even fully understood what was happening anymore. But he'd agreed when he was lucid, and Isaac had to honor that choice. He helped them lie down on the blankets, gave them each a drink of Mama Sable's sleeping mixture, the same thing she'd given Elias after the whipping, but stronger, much stronger. They'd feel no pain. They'd simply sleep and never wake up. Within minutes, both men's breathing had slowed to the deep, heavy rhythm of unconsciousness. Isaac checked their pulses, still strong, still alive. but soon the smoke would finish what disease and infection had started. "I'm sorry," Isaac whispered, though he knew they couldn't hear him. "I'm so sorry." He arranged their bodies carefully, making sure they'd be found together, making sure they looked roughly the same size and shape as him and Elias. Then he poured the lamp oil over the shed, soaking the old wood thoroughly. The smell made his eyes water. Isaac struck the flint once, twice. On the third strike, a spark caught in the kindling. Flame blossomed, small at first, then growing as it found the oil-soaked wood. Within seconds, the fire was racing up the walls of the shed, orange and hungry and unstoppable. He stepped back, watching the flames rise. The heat was intense even from several feet away. Smoke poured into the night sky, black and thick, carrying Marcus and Samuel's final gift with it. By the time someone shouted, "Fire!" Isaac was already running toward the oak tree by the river. Behind him, Red Hollow Plantation erupted into chaos. People poured from the quarters, shouting, trying to form a bucket line to fight the flames. But the shed was too far gone, and the fire was already spreading to the dry grass around it. Someone would find the bodies eventually. Someone would assume they were the twins, caught in the fire, dying heroes trying to fight the flames, or dying criminals who'd started them. It didn't matter which story they told themselves. What mattered was that Isaac and Elias had already become ghosts. The oak tree loomed out of the darkness, its split trunk unmistakable even in the dim light. Isaac pressed himself against the rough bark, breathing hard, and waited. Minutes passed. Each one felt like an hour. In the distance, the fire was a red glow against the black sky. Voices still shouted. Bells were ringing. The whole plantation was awake now, dealing with the disaster. Where was Elias? Isaac's chest tightened. What if something had gone wrong? What if Brant had woken up? What if Elias had been caught? Then a shadow detached itself from the trees. Isaac tensed, ready to run, before he recognized the way the figure moved. The slight hitch in the left step from an old ankle injury, the way the shoulders hunched slightly forward. His own movement, Elias's movement, their movement. "Took you long enough," Isaac breathed. Elias materialized beside him, and even in the darkness, Isaac could see the blood on his brother's hands. Not a lot, but enough. "Brant?" Isaac asked. "Dead," Elias said flatly. "Put him in his own harness, strung him up like he's done to so many of us. Let him know what it felt like before he died." There was something hollow in Elias's voice that Isaac had never heard before. An emptiness. The fire that usually burned in his brother had been replaced by ashes. "Are you all right?" "No," Elias said honestly, "but I will be, once we're free, once we're far from this place." Isaac pulled out the cloth bundles Mama Sable had given him. He handed Elias the red thread, the one that was supposed to be his, but that Isaac had been wearing to maintain their switched identities. Elias took the blue thread in return. "Back to ourselves," Isaac said. "Were we ever anything but?" Elias replied. They had no answer for that. So instead, they turned toward the river and began to run. The water was cold when they entered it, shocking after the heat of the fire and the warm Mississippi night. Isaac had chosen this spot carefully. The river was deep enough here to hide their scent from the dogs that would inevitably come, but calm enough that they could move quickly without being swept away by the current. They waded north, staying in the shallows when they could, swimming when they had to. Behind them, Red Hollow Plantation continued to burn. The glow lit up the southern horizon for hours, a beacon of destruction that Isaac refused to look back at. Around dawn, they pulled themselves onto the bank and collapsed in the shelter of a willow tree. They were both shaking with exhaustion and cold, but they'd covered miles, good miles, miles that put distance between them and everything they'd ever known. "We really did it," Elias said, staring up at the leaves above them as the sky began to lighten. "We're free, we're alive," Isaac corrected. "Free is different. Free is something we have to get to." "You always did think too much," Elias said, but there was affection in his voice. He reached out and gripped Isaac's hand. "Thank you. For the plan, for—" He trailed off, But Isaac understood, for seeing him, for believing he was worth saving, for being willing to become a killer so that Elias wouldn't have to die a slave. "We did it together," Isaac said, "like everything else." They rested for an hour, then pushed on. The supplies Isaac had hidden along the route sustained them: dried corn, stolen bread, a knife, flint, 2 rough blankets. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They moved primarily at night, sleeping during the day in whatever cover they could find. Twice they heard dogs in the distance, but the river had done its work. The dogs never found their trail. On the 3rd day, they cut east as Isaac had planned, leaving the river behind and heading into rougher country. The forest here was thick and tangled, full of places to hide, but it was also full of dangers: Confederate patrols, slave catchers, men who'd shoot first and ask questions never. They saw their first patrol on the 4th night. 6 men on horseback, carrying rifles and torches, searching the woods. Isaac and Elias pressed themselves into the hollow of a fallen log, barely breathing as the men passed within 20 feet of their hiding place. "I'm telling you they're dead," one of the riders said. "Burned up in that fire. Old Thornhill's just wasting our time making us look." "Maybe," another replied, "but those bodies were pretty burned. Hard to tell if they was really the twins or not. And Brant and Harlan both dead the same night. That ain't coincidence. Coincidence or not, if those boys are out here, they're long gone by now. Or dead. Woods don't take kindly to runaways who don't know what they're doing." The patrol moved on, and Isaac released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Elias was grinning despite the danger. "They think we're dead," he whispered. "Or maybe they think we're alive. They don't know. That's beautiful. That's temporary," Isaac countered. "We need to keep moving." They traveled for 3 more days before they found the first sign that they were getting close to free territory. A small mark carved into a tree, the symbol Mama Sable had told Isaac to look for, placed there by the network of people who helped runaways reach freedom. A star with 7 points. "Follow the North Star," the symbol said. "Follow it home." That night, they found a safe house. A small cabin deep in the woods, owned by a Quaker woman named Elizabeth, who asked no questions and offered them bread, cheese, and a place to sleep in her barn. "You're the 4th group through here this month," she said, her lined face gentle in the lamplight. "The railroad's running strong these days. You boys rest tonight. Tomorrow I'll point you to the next station." Isaac and Elias slept in the hay that night. Truly slept for the first time since leaving Red Hollow. And when Isaac woke to find his brother watching the sunrise through the barn's open door, he saw something on Elias's face that he hadn't seen in years. Hope. They were going to make it. Against all odds, despite everything, they were going to survive. Freedom wasn't a moment. Isaac had imagined it would be, some clear line they'd cross where suddenly everything would be different. But as they traveled farther north over the following weeks, guided by the secret network of safe houses and abolitionists, he realized that freedom was more like morning fog lifting. Gradual, uncertain, sometimes hard to distinguish from what came before. They crossed into free territory on a rainy October night, wading through a creek that marked the border. The Quaker woman at the previous station had told them, "Once you cross that water, you're no longer property in the eyes of the law. You're men." But they didn't feel like men. They felt like ghosts, like echoes of people who died in a fire back at Red Hollow Plantation. The safe house on the northern side of the border was run by a freed black man named Solomon, who'd made the same journey 15 years earlier. He was in his 40s with grey threading through his hair and scars on his wrists where shackles had once bitten deep. "You'll stay here a few days," Solomon said, showing them to a small room at the back of his house. "Get your strength back. Then we'll talk about what comes next." "Next?" Elias asked. "We're free, isn't that it?" Solomon's expression was kind but sad. "Son, freedom is just the beginning. Now comes the hard part, figuring out how to live with what you've survived. Isaac understood what he meant. Already he felt it, the weight of Marcus and Samuel's deaths, the blood on Elias's hands and the poison on his own, the lives they'd taken to buy their own. That night, Isaac dreamed of Red Hollow for the first time. In the dream, he was standing in the burned shed, but Marcus and Samuel were alive, walking through the flames untouched. They looked at him with no accusation in their eyes, just a kind of peaceful acceptance. "You made it," Marcus said in the dream. "That's all that matters. You made it." Isaac woke with tears on his face and found Elias sitting by the window, staring out at the pre-dawn darkness. "Can't sleep either?" Isaac asked. "Haven't really slept since that night," Elias admitted. "I keep seeing his face, Brant's face, when he realized what was happening, when he understood that I wasn't you, that I was there to kill him." Regret. Elias was quiet for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "Not regret exactly, but it changed something. I thought killing him would feel like justice, like balance, but it just felt like more violence, like we became what they made us. We became survivors," Isaac said firmly. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Isaac didn't have an answer for that. Over the next few days, Solomon helped them begin the process of building new lives. He connected them with other freed people in the community, helped them find work at a lumber mill, taught them how to sign their names in the ledger where free black workers recorded their hours. That last part made Elias laugh, a sound Isaac hadn't heard in weeks. "We can write our own names now," Elias said, staring at the awkward letters he'd scratched into the ledger. "That's something. That's really something." They rented a small room above a stable and fell into a routine. Work during the day, evening meals with Solomon and his family, nights spent reading by candlelight, Isaac teaching Elias the letters he'd learned in secret back at Red Hollow, both of them hungry for knowledge that had been denied them their whole lives. But the past wasn't done with them yet. 6 weeks after they'd arrived, a slave catcher came to town. Isaac spotted him immediately. The hard eyes, the coiled whip at his belt, the way he studied every black face he saw with calculating assessment. The man was asking questions, showing a drawing to anyone who'd look. Isaac managed to get close enough to see the paper. It showed 2 faces, identical, with the words "Reward, $500 for the return of enslaved twins Isaac and Elias, property of Thornhill Plantation, Red Hollow, Mississippi. Wanted for murder and arson. $500. More money than Isaac had ever imagined, enough to make even friends into enemies. He found Elias at the mill and pulled him aside. "We have to leave. Now." They packed what little they had and slipped out of town before sunset, leaving Solomon a note thanking him for everything. They couldn't risk staying, couldn't risk bringing danger to the people who'd helped them. For the next month, they moved from town to town, never staying more than a few days in any place. The slave catcher seemed to be following some kind of trail, showing up in each location shortly after they left. Twice, Isaac caught glimpses of the man in crowds. Once, they literally ran into each other on a busy street, and Isaac was certain he'd been recognized. But the catcher had just looked at him, looked right through him, and moved on, because Isaac had been alone at that moment. The drawing showed twins together. The reward was for both of them. Separately, they were just 2 more black men in a world full of them. That night, Isaac proposed the unthinkable. "We need to split up," he said. Elias stared at him like he'd suggested cutting off his own arm. "What? He's looking for twins. Everyone's looking for twins. But if we're not together, we're invisible. We're just 2 men among thousands." "We've been together our whole lives," Elias said. "Since before we were born. You're asking me to—" "I'm asking us to survive," Isaac interrupted. "We've come too far to get caught now. We split up for 6 months, maybe a year. Let the search cool down. Then we meet again. Somewhere specific. Somewhere we choose. Where?" Isaac thought about it. "Philadelphia, the big church with the bell tower. Solomon told us about it. Independence Hall. 1 year from today at noon. We both show up. We're together again." Elias looked like he wanted to argue, but slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. 1 year, and then we never separate again." "Never," Isaac agreed. They split their money, their supplies, their few possessions. At dawn, they stood at a crossroads outside the town where they'd been staying. Elias would head east, Isaac would go west. They'd circle back to Philadelphia from different directions, taking different routes, becoming different people along the way. 1 year, Elias said, gripping Isaac's arm in that warrior's grip their mother had taught them. 1 year, Isaac replied, and then they walked away from each other for the first time in their lives. The months that followed were the loneliest Isaac had ever experienced. He'd never been truly alone before. Even in the worst moments at Red Hollow, Elias had been there, a mirror, a companion, another half of himself. Now Isaac moved through the world, singular and strange, feeling incomplete. He worked on a farm in Pennsylvania, helping with the autumn harvest. He spent 3 months in a factory in Ohio, working alongside immigrants who spoke languages he didn't understand. He learned to be just Isaac, not Isaac and Elias. He learned that he was quieter without his brother, more cautious, less willing to take risks. But he also learned that he was strong alone, that the water in him ran deep enough to sustain itself without the fire of Elias to heat it. Winter came, brutal and cold in ways the Mississippi winter had never been. Isaac found work splitting wood and nearly lost 2 fingers to frostbite before a kind widow named Mrs. Patterson took him in, gave him a room in her attic, and put him to work maintaining her small property. "You running from something?" she asked one evening as they sat by her fire. "Yes, ma'am," Isaac said honestly. There seemed no point in lying to her. "We all are," she replied. "Question is whether you're running from the past or toward the future." Isaac thought about that. "Both, I think." "That's the right answer," Mrs. Patterson said. "The past shapes us, but it doesn't own us. You remember that." As spring approached, Isaac began his journey toward Philadelphia. He had enough money saved to buy a train ticket part way, and he walked the rest. The year was almost up. Soon he'd see Elias again. Soon they'd be whole. He arrived in Philadelphia 3 days before the appointed meeting time and found a boarding house where he could wait. The city was huge and loud and overwhelming after the quiet places he'd been staying. But there was also something liberating about it. The sheer number of people meant he could disappear completely into the crowd. On the morning of the meeting day, Isaac woke before dawn. He dressed carefully in the new clothes he'd bought for the occasion, simple but clean, the clothes of a working man, not a slave. He pinned his blue thread to the inside of his collar, hidden but there, a reminder of who he'd been and who he'd become. At 11 o'clock he left the boarding house and began walking toward Independence Hall. His heart was pounding. Would Elias be there? What if something had happened? What if the slave catcher had found him? What if... Isaac forced himself to breathe, to trust. They'd made a promise. Elias would be there. The church bell was beginning to toll noon when Isaac reached the hall. It was crowded with tourists and locals, people moving in all directions. Isaac stood near the entrance, scanning faces, looking for the one face that was identical to his own. Minutes passed. The bell finished tolling. Noon had come and gone. Elias wasn't there. Isaac waited. 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. The afternoon shadows grew long, and still his brother didn't appear. As the sun began to set, Isaac felt something break inside him. Some fragile hope he'd been carrying for an entire year. What if Elias was dead? What if he'd been caught? What if Isaac was alone now, truly and completely alone? He returned to the boarding house and lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past year and wondering where it had all gone wrong. The next morning, Isaac went back to Independence Hall, and the next day, and the next. For a full week, he returned to the same spot at noon, waiting for a brother who never came. On the 8th day, a man approached him. He was well-dressed, black, probably in his 50s, with kind eyes and a serious expression. "You're waiting for someone," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Isaac replied. "Someone who looks like you." Isaac's blood went cold. "Why do you ask?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Because I was asked to watch for a man who looked like this." He unfolded the paper, and Isaac found himself staring at a drawing of his own face. Or Elias's face. The same face. "Who are you?" Isaac asked. "My name is David Wright. I'm part of the Vigilance Committee. We help fugitive slaves stay free. Your brother came through here 6 months ago." 6 months? Isaac's mind reeled. "But we were supposed to meet." "He was caught," David said gently. "Slave catchers found him in New Jersey, but the Vigilance Committee helped him escape again. We put him on a ship to Canada. He's in Toronto now. He's safe." "Why didn't he come here? Why didn't he wait?" David's expression was compassionate but firm. "Because waiting would have meant getting caught again, and he left me this, in case you came looking." He handed Isaac a small envelope. Inside was a letter, written in Elias's newly learned hand, the letters shaky but clear. "Brother, if you're reading this, then you made it. I'm sorry I couldn't wait. They almost had me. Canada is safe, really safe. Come north. There's a church in Toronto, St. James Cathedral. I'll be there first Sunday of every month at noon. However long it takes, I'll wait. We're not done yet. E." Isaac read the letter 3 times before he could speak. "How do I get to Canada?" David smiled. "The same way your brother did. The railroad doesn't end at free territory. It goes all the way to freedom." The journey to Canada took another month. Isaac traveled with a group of 7 other fugitives, guided by conductors who moved them from safe house to safe house, always north, always toward the border that represented true freedom. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping in barns and cellars during the day. The conductors were cautious to the point of paranoia, and Isaac understood why. Even in free territory, slave catchers operated. Even in states where slavery was illegal, bounty hunters still prowled, looking for easy money. The group was diverse. There was Ruth, a woman in her 30s who'd escaped from a plantation in Virginia with her 2 young children. There was Thomas, barely 16, who'd run after watching his father sold away. There was an elderly couple, Jonah and Mary, who'd waited 40 years for their chance at freedom and had finally taken it when their master's death left the plantation in chaos. They rarely spoke during the journey, conserving their energy and maintaining the silence that kept them safe. But on the nights when they did share stories, Isaac learned that each of them carried the same weight. The cost of freedom measured in lost family, painful choices, and violence that couldn't be undone. "You got family waiting in Canada?" Ruth asked one night as they huddled in a damp root cellar, listening to rain pound the ground above them. "My brother," Isaac said. "My twin." "Must be nice," she said quietly, "having someone who understands, who was there." She looked at her sleeping children, their faces innocent even in the dim lantern light. "Sometimes I wonder if I did right, bringing them. They're so young. They don't remember much from before. Maybe they'd have been better off not knowing this fear." "They'll remember freedom," Isaac said. "They'll grow up free. That's worth everything." Ruth nodded, but Isaac could see she wasn't entirely convinced. And he understood that too. Freedom came with its own kind of pain, the pain of memory, the pain of survival guilt, the pain of knowing that for every person who made it north, dozens more were still in chains. They reached the Canadian border on a cold April morning. The crossing itself was anticlimactic. They simply walked across a bridge over a river from one country to another, from slavery's reach to complete legal freedom. No bells rang. No great celebration marked the moment. They just walked across, and suddenly they were in a place where they were legally human beings with rights and protections. Ruth fell to her knees on the Canadian side and wept. Her children, not understanding but sensing the importance, cried with her. Thomas stood very still, as if afraid that moving would somehow send him back across the border. Jonah and Mary held each other, too overwhelmed for words. Isaac felt tears on his own face, though he wasn't sure if they were tears of joy or grief. Both, perhaps. Grief for what had been lost. Joy for what might still be possible. The conductor who'd brought them this far, a stern woman named Harriet, who'd made the journey 19 times, bringing more than 70 people to freedom, smiled at them all. "Welcome home," she said simply. They were taken to a settlement outside Toronto, where freed slaves had built a small community. Houses, a school, a church, farms, spreading across land that belonged to the people who worked it. Isaac had never imagined such a place could exist. "First thing you need to do is register with the authorities," a man named William told him. William ran a boarding house in the settlement and seemed to know everyone and everything. "Get your freedom papers officially recognized. Then you can start building a real life." "My brother," Isaac said. "He's supposed to be at St. James Cathedral, first Sunday of every month." William's expression brightened. "Elias, tall fellow, looks just like you. He's been coming regular as clockwork for 6 months. Lives on the east side, works at the docks. Good man. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's made a place here. Can you take me to him?" "Son, it's Thursday. He'll be at the cathedral in 3 days. I think he'd want the meeting to be there like you planned. Some promises are important to keep exactly as they were made." So Isaac waited. 3 more days after an entire year. It felt like an eternity and no time at all. He spent the days exploring the settlement, marveling at the sight of black children playing freely, black men and women conducting business, owning property, living lives that would have been impossible south of the border. It was beautiful and strange and painful all at once. On Saturday night, Isaac couldn't sleep. He lay in the small room William had given him and thought about the journey that had brought him here. Red Hollow Plantation felt like something from another life, a nightmare he'd finally woken from. But the memories were still sharp. Brant's body in the harness, Harlan drinking the poisoned whiskey, Marcus and Samuel sleeping as the fire took them. His mother's grave in the plantation cemetery, marked only with a stone that bore no name. Would she be proud of him? Would she understand the choices he'd made? Isaac wanted to believe she would. He wanted to believe that survival was its own form of honor. Sunday morning arrived clear and bright. Isaac dressed carefully in his best clothes and began the walk into Toronto proper. St. James Cathedral rose against the skyline, its spire pointing toward heaven. As noon approached, Isaac's steps quickened despite his best efforts to maintain composure. What would he say to Elias? How could he express everything he'd felt during their year apart? How could he explain the loneliness, the fear, the constant wondering if his brother was alive or dead? The cathedral bells began to toll noon as Isaac entered the church. It was beautiful inside, all soaring arches and stained glass that painted the pews in colors Isaac had never seen in a church before. At Red Hollow, slaves had been forced to attend services in the balcony of the Master's church, separated and silent. This was different. This was a place that welcomed everyone. Isaac's eyes scanned the congregation, looking for the one face that mirrored his own, and then he saw him. Elias stood near the back, dressed in clothes that were clean and well-made, his hair cut short, his face fuller than Isaac remembered. He looked healthy. He looked free. Their eyes met across the church, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Elias was walking toward him, and Isaac was moving too, and they met in the middle of the aisle and embraced with a ferocity that made several other parishioners look over in surprise. "You made it," Elias said, his voice breaking. "You actually made it." "So did you," Isaac replied, holding his brother tight. "So did you." They stood like that for a long time, 2 identical men holding each other as if afraid the other might disappear if they let go. Finally, they pulled apart, And Isaac saw that Elias was crying. He realized he was too. "I have so much to tell you," Elias said. "About the escape, about getting caught, about Canada." "Later," Isaac interrupted. "Right now, I just want to be here, with you, like we promised." They sat together in the pew as the service continued around them, neither of them really listening to the sermon. They just sat shoulder to shoulder, the way they'd sat as children in the quarters at Red Hollow, finding comfort in proximity, in the knowledge that they weren't alone. After the service ended, they walked out into the Toronto sunlight together. Elias took Isaac to the small room he rented, showed him the docks where he worked, introduced him to the friends he'd made. Isaac told Elias about his year, about the people he'd met, about Mrs. Patterson and her fire and her wisdom. That night, they sat on the edge of the dock, their feet dangling over the water, and watched the sun set over Lake Ontario. "Do you think about it?" Elias asked quietly. "About what we did?" "Every day," Isaac admitted. "Do you regret it?" Isaac thought about the question carefully. "No, I regret that it was necessary. I regret living in a world where those were our only choices. But I don't regret choosing freedom. I don't regret choosing us." Elias nodded slowly. "I used to be so angry all the time. That fire you always talked about, it was real. It was burning me up from the inside. But up here in this place where I can just be a person, the fire's different now. It's not rage anymore. It's just life, warmth, the thing that keeps me going. And the water in me isn't about survival anymore," Isaac said. "It's about growth, about nurturing something new." "Und steam," Elias said, and they both smiled at the memory of Mama Sable's words. "Yeah," Isaac agreed. "Steam." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had watched over them at Red Hollow. But somehow they looked different here, brighter, more numerous, free. "What happens now?" Elias asked. "Now we live," Isaac said simply. "We work. We build something. We make sure Marcus and Samuel's sacrifice meant something. We make sure our mother's life meant something. We tell our story," Isaac considered that, "eventually, when it's safe, when we can do it without risking ourselves or the people who helped us. But yes, eventually, people need to know about Red Hollow, about all the Red Hollows, about what slavery really costs." "A debt paid in blood and fire," Elias said quietly. "A debt that can never really be repaid," Isaac corrected. "But we can try. We can spend the rest of our lives trying." They stayed on the dock until well after dark. Two brothers who'd survived the unthinkable, reunited in a place where they could finally begin to heal. The journey wasn't over. Healing would take years, maybe a lifetime. But for the first time since that night on Red Hollow Plantation, Isaac felt something like peace settling into his bones. They'd made it. Against all odds, they'd made it. The years that followed were not easy, but they were theirs. Isaac and Elias built a life in Toronto that neither of them could have imagined during their days at Red Hollow Plantation. They worked hard, saved money, and eventually bought a small piece of land on the edge of the settlement where they built a house with their own hands. But the past was never far behind them. In 1842, 3 years after they'd arrived in Canada, word reached Toronto that Red Hollow Plantation had finally collapsed. Master Thornhill had drunk himself to death, and without his leadership, the plantation had fallen into debt and chaos. The land was sold at auction. The enslaved people were scattered to other plantations throughout Mississippi, families torn apart in the final violent throes of a dying institution. Isaac learned this from a newly arrived fugitive who'd come from the same county. The man, whose name was Joseph, recognized their names immediately. "You're them," Joseph said, his eyes wide. "The twins, the ones who killed the overseers and burned down the quarters. You're like legends back there. People tell stories about you." "What kind of stories?" Elias asked warily. "Different kinds," Joseph said. "Some say you were demons sent to punish the wicked. Some say you were angels of justice. Some say you were just men who'd had enough. But everyone agrees on one thing. After you left, things changed. Not everywhere, not permanently, but people remembered that it was possible to fight back, to win. Isaac didn't know how to feel about being a legend. He and Elias weren't demons or angels. They were just men who'd made impossible choices in an impossible situation. But maybe that was what legends were. Ordinary people pushed to extraordinary action by circumstances that left no room for ordinary responses. "Is Mama Sable still alive?" Isaac asked, almost afraid of the answer. Joseph nodded. "She was when I left 6 months ago. She's old now, real old, but still working. She told me if I saw you boys up here, I should tell you she's proud. Said you did what you had to do, and you did it with honor." Isaac felt tears prick his eyes. He'd often wondered if Mama Sable had survived the aftermath of their escape, if she'd been punished for helping them. Knowing she was alive, knowing she approved, was a gift he hadn't expected. That night, Isaac and Elias sat by the fire in their small house and talked about Red Hollow for the first time in years. They'd avoided the subject, both of them carrying wounds that went too deep for easy discussion. But Joseph's arrival had opened something. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Elias asked. "Killing them, I mean. Burning the quarters." "I think we did the only thing," Isaac replied carefully. "Right and wrong are luxuries. We didn't have luxuries." But we have them now," Elias pressed. "Now looking back with time and distance, was it justice or just revenge?" Isaac stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. "Maybe it was both. Maybe that's okay. They were killing us, Elias. Slowly, systematically, every single day. We just did it faster. I dream about Brant sometimes," Elias admitted quietly. "About his face when he realized I wasn't you. When he understood that he'd underestimated us. There was fear in his eyes, real terror. And I felt satisfied. Is that evil, to feel satisfied by another person's fear?" "I don't know," Isaac said honestly. "But I know that he never lost sleep over the fear he caused, never questioned the terror he inflicted on us, on Marcus, on Samuel, on Mama Sable, on everyone he had power over. Maybe the fact that you're questioning it, that you're troubled by it, is what makes you different from him." They sat in silence for a while. Then Elias said, "I want to go back." Isaac looked at his brother in surprise. "To Mississippi? That's insane. You'd be killed or re-enslaved within a week." "Not to Mississippi," Elias clarified. "I want to go back in spirit. I want to tell the story, our story, not as legends or ghosts, but as what we really were, 2 men who refused to die slaves." Isaac understood immediately what his brother meant. Over the past few years, the abolitionist movement had been growing stronger. Frederick Douglass had published his autobiography, sharing his story with the world. Other formerly enslaved people were speaking out, putting faces and names and specific experiences to the abstract evil of slavery. "You want to speak publicly," Isaac said. "We want to speak publicly," Elias corrected. "Together. Like everything else we've done, it took 2 years to make it happen. They had to be careful, had to make sure that speaking out wouldn't put them at risk of kidnapping or worse. But finally, in 1844, they stood on a stage in Toronto at an abolitionist meeting and told their story. They didn't sugarcoat it. They didn't make themselves into heroes. They simply told the truth. About Red Hollow Plantation, about the daily violence and degradation, about the whipping that had pushed them past endurance, and about the night they'd chosen violence over submission. The audience was silent throughout. Some people wept, others looked angry, but everyone listened. Afterward, a white woman approached them. She was well-dressed, clearly wealthy, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been afraid. Her name was Margaret, and she was a writer. "I want to publish your story," she said. "Not just as a speech, but as a book. People need to read this. They need to understand what slavery really means, what it really costs." Isaac and Elias looked at each other. They told their story, but writing it down, publishing it, making it permanent, that was different. That was creating a record that would outlast them, that would speak to future generations. "We'll do it," Isaac said, "but we write it ourselves. Our words, our story." Margaret agreed, and over the next year, Isaac and Elias worked on the manuscript. It was painful, dragging up memories they'd tried to bury. But it was also cathartic, taking ownership of their narrative, refusing to let others interpret or soften or romanticize what they'd experienced. The book was published in 1845 under the title Steam Rising, The Testament of Two Brothers. It sold modestly at first, but gradually word spread. Abolitionists read it, former slaves read it, even some sympathetic Southerners read it, though they had to do so in secret. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Slave owners and their supporters called the book lies, called Isaac and Elias murderers and criminals. There were threats, letters promising violence if they ever set foot in the American South again. But there was also support. People who saw their courage and understood their choices. Through it all, Isaac and Elias remained in Canada, building their life, working their land, becoming part of the community that had welcomed them. They married, Isaac to a woman named Sarah, who'd escaped from a plantation in Kentucky, Elias to a woman named Grace, who'd been born free in Pennsylvania, but had moved to Canada seeking a community that understood the weight of the past. They had children. Isaac's son was named Marcus Samuel, after the men who died so they could live. Elias's daughter was named Hope because that was what they'd found in Canada. A second chance. A future. As the years passed, the story of the twins from Red Hollow Plantation took on new dimensions. Their book was translated into multiple languages. They spoke at abolitionist meetings across Canada and the northern United States, always together, always honest about both the horror and the hope. In 1863, when news reached them that President Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Isaac and Elias stood in their field and wept. It wasn't complete freedom. The proclamation only freed slaves in rebellious states, and the war still raged. But it was a beginning. "Mama Sable was right," Elias said, his arm around his brother's shoulders as they watched the sunset. "We made steam, fire and water together, creating something that couldn't be contained. We did it together," Isaac said. Like everything else, they lived long lives. Isaac died in 1889 at the age of 70, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Elias followed 3 years later in 1892, his last words a whisper to his daughter. "Tell them we were free. Tell them we chose our own ending." They were buried side by side in a cemetery outside Toronto, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names, birth dates, death dates, and a single line, "Brothers in bondage, brothers in freedom, brothers always." But their story didn't end with their deaths. The book they'd written continued to circulate. Their descendants kept the memory alive, passing down the tale of the twin brothers who'd refused to accept slavery's final judgment, who'd chosen violence over submission, freedom over certainty, hope over despair. And on certain nights, travelers passing through what had once been Red Hollow Plantation, long since abandoned, the big house collapsed, the fields returned to wilderness, reported strange sightings. Two figures walking side by side through the mist. Two identical men whose faces were impossible to see clearly, but whose voices carried on the wind, whispering to each other in perfect unison. The local people, descendants of those who'd once been enslaved there, called it a haunting, but they didn't fear it. They said the twins were keeping watch, making sure that what had happened at Red Hollow was never forgotten, never repeated. They said it was balance restored, justice delayed, but never denied. The accounting of a debt that slavery had written in blood, and the two brothers had paid in fire and water, and the steam that rose between them. They said that on the anniversary of that harvest moon night in 1839, you could still smell smoke on the air, and hear the river running strong, carrying two men north toward freedom, toward hope, toward a future they'd had to steal with their own hands. They said the twins had never really left Red Hollow. They just transformed it, turned it from a place of suffering into a monument to resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest places, even in the most impossible circumstances, the human spirit could find a way to fight back, to survive, to win. And in Toronto, in the house that Isaac and Elias had built with their own hands, their descendants still kept two objects on the mantle, a red thread and a blue thread, faded with age but carefully preserved, tied together in a knot that could never be undone. Fire and water, two brothers, one unbreakable bond, steam rising forever and always from the ashes of Red Hollow Plantation.